Howdy folks, my name is Nathan Ranney and I am going to give you a brief overview of Hurtboxes and Hitboxes and how to set them up in GameMaker. So for those of you who don't know, a Hurtbox and Hitbox are basically just collision checks. We're checking to see if one box overlaps the other, and if it does, then do some stuff. Like take damage, or you could get healed, you could play a sound, you could do literally anything. Here's a visualization of what a hitbox and hurtbox actually is. So the blue boxes that you see here are going to be your hurt boxes. Think of it this way. If something touches your hurt box, you get hurt. The red box is going to be the hit box. And that's what we're checking collisions for, checking against. We're checking to see if the red hitbox touches someone else's or another object's hurt box. And when that happens, we do whatever it is we're going to do. So you can see here the hurt boxes and hit boxes overlap for this particular guy, this businessman here. His hitbox does not hit himself, because that would be ridiculous. So yeah, if his red box were to touch another businessman or ninja or whatever else, then that businessman ninja would take damage. So how do we go about setting this up? The first thing we need to do is we need to create a couple sprites. And I've already done them here. This is already all set up in this blog, so I'm just going to pull up the code and point at everything and show you what's what. And you can pause the video if you want to copy it all down. Otherwise, there is a supplementary blog that goes along with it that there will be a link to. So the first thing you need to do is create a couple of sprites. Create one for the hitbox, which is just SPR hitbox. Whatever naming convention you want to use is fine. All that really matters is that you have a 1 pixel sprite and that it's red. And the reason it's 1 pixel is because when we create the hitbox object, we'll be able to scale it to whatever size we want. So go ahead and do that, and then create one for the hurtbox as well. Same thing, just make it green. 1 pixel and green. Now, once you have done that, we need to create a couple of objects. We need a hurtbox object and a hitbox object. So create your hurtbox object, and in the create event, add this code here. Image alpha 0.5, that just makes the object transparent when it's created, so you can draw it over your character objects or whatever else, and then you can still see the object behind it. Owner, that's going to be who owns this hurtbox. So in the example here, the owner of the hurtbox is here, and the hitbox is the same object, right? And when they check, when this hitbox checks to see if it is hitting someone else or another hurtbox, it compares the owner and says, hey, is this the same owner as me? If so, don't do anything. If it's not the same owner, that means that's a bad guy and to do something. So we need owner, X offset and Y offset. This is basically going to help us position the hurtbox object when it is created. So once you've got all that in there, that's all the code we need for the hurtbox. The hitbox, pretty similar. There's some extra stuff here though. So we've got the image alpha, we've got the owner, we've got the X offset, Y offset, and then we need some other stuff. So we've got life, which is essentially how long the hitbox lingers for, how long it exists in game. Life is just easiest for me to understand, like how long is this thing alive before it goes away, and that's 0 by default. X hit and Y hit are the horizontal and vertical force that's applied to whatever it is you're hitting. So if X hit was like 10 and Y hit was 0, then it would push back whatever it was you're hitting 10 pixels a frame, so however fast your game's running. Ignore and ignore list, that's how we're going to determine if we've hit someone more than once or hit an object more than once. We don't want to hit something more than one time, so we'll come to that in a bit. and hit stun, which is how long they are put into like a stun state after you get hit. So if you've ever played Street Fighter or anything like that, if you get hit with some move, you can't move for a certain amount of time. There's nothing you can do, and that's how combos work. So we want hit stun. We just put on 60 for now. It can be whatever, but 60 is fine. Okay. There's a couple other things that the hitbox needs. First, we're going to start with step. Okay, so add the step event, and this one's real simple. It's just life minus minus. That just means life depletes by 1 per frame, as long as it's alive. You could also do life minus equals 1, but this is the same thing, doing minus minus. Now we need in step, so let's pop that in there. This is where it gets destroyed, right? So we're checking to see if our life variable is less than or equal to 0. It shouldn't ever be less than 0, but because we're only subtracting by 1, so it's not like we'd be subtracting by 2, where it could overshoot 0 and end up at -1, but less than equal to, it's just a little, just to make sure that that never happens for some weird reason. And then we call instance destroy. So when life is less than or equal to 0, delete the hitbox object from the game. We don't need it anymore. And now when it is destroyed, we have to open the destroy event, and we need to make sure that we reset the owner of the hitbox back to -1. So basically, when a character or an object creates a hitbox, an owner is assigned, and that value is always greater than 0, and I'll explain why in a bit. So when this is destroyed, we want it to just kind of erase that information from the owner so that the owner doesn't still think it has a hitbox out there somewhere. And then we need to destroy the ignore list. So if you remember in the create event, we see this ignore list gets created. When the hitbox is created, it'll get populated with some data, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But when the object is destroyed, the list needs to be explicitly destroyed as well. If this does not happen, the list will continue to exist, and if you created enough hitboxes, you would run into memory leaks and your game would crash and everything would be bad. So that's pretty much it for setting up the hitbox and hurtbox objects. But now we need a couple of scripts to help us manage these and use them. Let's go into scripts, and I've got some boxes already. And the first one that we are going to start with is hurtbox create. So create a script. If you're following along, just name it exactly what I've got here. And we are going to assign some variables here and do some stuff. So the first thing we need to do is when we call this script, it's going to create a hurtbox. So we're going to do that here. We're going to take the _hurtbox variable that we've instantiated in this script. The reason that I do _hurtbox, _hitbox, whatever in scripts is just in case, for any reason, you would need to use the same variable name, like hurtbox, for example, outside of the script. So if my player object had a hurtbox variable, when I would call the script, by putting an underscore in front of it, I mean, it makes it a different variable. It makes sure things can't get crossed and goofed up. So whenever I do scripts, I try to do that. So first line, we're instantiating the _hurtbox variable, and we are assigning the ID of the hurtbox here that we are creating. So instance create xy hurtbox. Now the xy is just going to create it at the xy position of whatever object is calling this script. In our case, it's going to be like a player or an enemy. Next, we need to assign the owner. So the owner is just ID, which is a built-in GameMaker variable that stores the ID of whatever object. So like player is the name of the object, but the ID of the object is actually a series of numbers determined by GameMaker, and that's what this is equal to. So this is equal to those unique numbers based on the particular instance of an object that is calling it. So just for example, if I had two player objects in the game, player object, the first one might have an ID of 0, 1, and the second one would have an object ID of 0, 2. In reality, it's like 6 characters or whatever, but you get the idea. So now we need to scale the Hurtbox on its horizontal axis, which is X scale, and its vertical axis, which is Y scale. Now this is what actually changes the size of the object and will make it fit our player. Now when you put arguments in here, so argument 0, argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, that means you have to pass in some data when you call up this script. And I will show you what that means here in a minute, but for now we'll just do argument 0, 1, and then for X offset, Y offset 2, and 3. And I already explained what these are. It's just basically the position of the hitbox. Sorry, Hurtbox in this case. So yeah, this is all you need for a Hurtbox create, and Hitbox create, pretty similar, right? A couple extra bits of data here because we need the life, the X hit. Now, if you were going to do Y hit, you would need another argument here. In this example, I'm only using X hit just for the sake of simplicity, but yeah, it would just follow the same pattern here, argument. I would probably do like hitbox.y hit equals argument 6, and then change this one to 7, so that way they're in order, but yeah. And then we need a hit stun, argument 6, return hitbox. Same situation that we had over here. Now, we need to actually create our Hurtbox for our character. So for the player, in the create event, now this is also assuming that you've been kind of following along with what I've been doing on previous projects. There's a lot of stuff here that I'm not going to explain. I'm not going to explain the collision system. I'm not going to explain how character sprites are drawn, or how the animations work, or how state machines are set up, or any of that. There's a bunch of blogs that I've written that explain all that stuff, and kind of you follow this entire series from nothing to the final project, which we're at now. So those links will be provided for you if you want to start from 0 and see how we got here. But this is explicitly for Hitbox and Hitbox setup. So if you're a little confused about the other details not pertaining to Hitbox and Hurtbox, don't sweat it. That information's out there. So we're going to go to our player object, and what we need to do is we've got to call up our Hurtbox create. So the script we just typed, remember, it needed 4 different arguments, and like I said, I'm assigning it to the Hurtbox. So let's look at this one more time. Okay. So we're creating the Hurtbox. We're assigning the owner. That can happen automatically. We don't need arguments for that. But for X scale and Y scale, we need 2 arguments. So here's argument 0 right here. Argument 1. So here's our X scale and our Y scale. We want this to be 18 pixels wide, because remember, it's a 1 pixel Hurtbox sprite. So we want it to be 18 pixels wide, 24 pixels tall. And depending on the size of your character and the application of how you're using this, you're going to have to change those values yourself. That's up to you. The X offset, which is -9, so it's basically gonna scale this thing 18 pixels wide, 24 pixels tall, and is gonna position it 9 pixels to the left and 24 pixels up to our character's origin. Now our character's origin is 1632. It's a 32 by 32 sprite, so 1632 is at the bottom of the sprite, right in the middle. So that means this hitbox is going to go 9 pixels to the left and 24 pixels up. So it's going to start in this corner basically and come all the way down to here. Now, there's this other piece of the script that I forgot to mention before. Return basically just returns the information that is stored in this variable. So underscore Hurtbox, which in our case is just the ID of the Hurtbox we've created. And since we've returned it, we've also stored it in a local Hurtbox variable in our player object, so it can reference it as needed. And we also need to set the hitbox to just -1. Like, we're not creating a hitbox when the player is created. We're only going to create a hitbox under certain circumstances, like in the middle of an attack. So this just needs to be -1 for now. We'll assign stuff to that as it comes up. And now, if we just run the game now, I mean, if I run it, everything's going to work, but all we did was create the hitbox, right? We didn't tell it where to go. We just said, hey, create it on the player's origin when the game starts. But it doesn't follow the player. It doesn't do anything yet. So in the player's in-step event, we have this piece of code, right? Well, we got some hitbox stuff here, but we've got, this is what's important right now, hurtbox, okay? So we say with hurtbox, and what that does is, remember, we've stored the ID of the hurtbox we created in this variable, right? So whenever we need to talk to that hurtbox, we just use this variable, okay? Now when you say with, that is basically like running code from inside of the other object we're talking to. So even though this is our player object code, when we say with hurtbox, it's like, hey, tell the hurtbox to do stuff, but run this code as if you were the hurtbox. Now, when you do that, you gain access to other. And other just refers back to whatever object is calling with. So we have our player who's saying with hurtbox, and then the hurtbox is saying other, which refers back to the player. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but it's just kind of like a back and forth. So what this code does is we're running from the hurtbox, so we say x, which in this case is the hurtbox is x, because again, we're using with, equals other.x, so the player's x, the player object's x position, plus the x offset that we've set for it. Same thing for y. You can see the hurtbox follows him around. That's what we want. So there you go. That's the basics of how a hurtbox works. Now, for the hitbox, we need to do a little bit of extra stuff. So we need kind of the same thing here, but with an extra condition. So this says if hitbox does not equal -1. So remember, when the player is created, we have hitbox equals -1. And then when our hitbox is destroyed, it resets that variable for the owner, which would be a player or an enemy or whatever object, back to -1. So this basically says, hey, if your hitbox is not equal to -1, then you are allowed to update its position. If this wasn't here, so if we didn't have this line and we just tried to say with hitbox, it would crash because -1 is not the ID of an object. So the game would just say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, and I'm going to stop cooperating, and would crash. This also ensures that you're not getting a bunch of additional checks and weird information. But anyway, so we're doing the same thing. We're doing with hitbox, and we're updating its position exactly like we did here. And that's important for all kinds of stuff. But basically, if your character is moving and they do an attack and the hitbox needs to follow them, it will. Pretty basic stuff. All right, now we need to actually create a hitbox from the player. And then we'll come back and go over this collision stuff, which is actually checking how to hit guys. So we're going to go to the player's attack state. And the easiest way to create a hitbox in this particular setup is to check what frame of animation the character is on. So in the attack, let's look at the attack sprite here real quick. Let's edit this. We'll pop it open. So here's the attack sprite. It's 8 frames. Here's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 8 frames, and then it starts back over. So what we want to do is we need to figure out, like, based on this attack animation, where should the hitbox be created? Well, not here, right? Because he's winding up. He's starting to follow through. He's almost there. Boom. That's the attack animation. That's when this attack becomes live and can actually hit people, okay? And then it follows through, and then it'll probably stop about there. And then we'll return back to our neutral state with no hitbox and pretty basic stuff. So what this is called, there's 3 parts to every attack in basically every game you've ever played. And I'm just using fighting game vernacular here because it makes the most sense to me, but you've got the startup of your attack, right? And the startup is basically how long it takes from when you've pushed the attack button until the attack can actually hit someone. So if you think about actually throwing a punch, right? Like you got the wind up, which is this frame, and this frame. Like these two aren't technically wind up, right? But they're follow through. They're not actually hitting anybody yet, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3 frames of startup. And then on the 4th frame, this is active now. Okay, so we have startup and then active. Active means the hitbox is capable of dealing damage to someone, something, some other object is capable of doing whatever your hitbox needs to do, okay? It stays active for a certain number of frames, probably about to here. And then you go into recovery, which is kind of like startup in that there's no hitbox, but you're still in an attack animation. Only difference is recovery is returning back to your neutral state. So if you think about throwing a punch again, you've got your wind up, okay? And then you throw the punch and it's out there and it's ready to connect to someone's face. And then your arm follows through, okay? And before you can throw another punch, you've got to bring your arm all the way back and then back to the starting point again. And then you can go back and do another wind up, right? So the time it takes you to reach the neutral position before you can start another attack is called recovery. And balancing startup, active, and recovery frames is key to having a balanced game and something that feels good. And changing those variables can have huge impacts on the game. Anyway, we know what frame we want to create the attack on, right? This is our this is our 4th frame. So we need to check and say, hey, does our frame equal 0? And do we not have a hitbox? Right? Is hitbox equaling -1 means we don't have a hitbox. If that's true, then let's create a hitbox. And again, here's the hitbox data. By the way, I just found this out like an embarrassingly short time ago. If you middle click on stuff, on like script names, it just opens the script. Look at this. Anyway, so we're doing kind of what we did with a Hurtbox when we create it. We've got the hitbox variable, and it's equal to the hitbox create script. Now this is a lot of data, right? This looks totally different than the other one. There's all kinds of like what is facing and multiplications and all these other bits of information. It's not as scary as it looks, okay? As always, or as with the Hurtbox, we're creating it, storing it in the hitbox variable, giving it an owner, so we don't need to do anything there. That happens automatically. We need to set the X and Y scale. So when creating a hitbox, the X and Y scale are a little different. You need to ensure that when you create the hitbox, it extends in the direction that you want it to. So if you're facing to the right, it needs to extend to the right. If you're facing to the left, it needs to extend to the left. So that's what this facing variable is. It's a variable I have set up in the player object. And when the player is facing right, facing is 1. When the player is facing left, facing is -1. Pretty simple. And then I use that to like draw the player facing the right direction, flip their sprite, whatever, and to make sure my hitboxes go to the right place. So if I'm facing to the right, this is going to be 20, right? Because it's 20 times 1. If I'm facing to the left, it'll be -20. So yeah. Then we've got 12 for the Y scale. So we want it to be 12 pixels tall. X offset, -3 times facing. So again, it's it's based on the direction that your character is facing. In this case, it's 3 pixels to the character's backside, right? So if I'm facing right, the back of the character is to the left. If I'm facing left, back of the character is to the right. And we've got Y offset, so -16, that's just like the Hurtbox, how far up or down you want it to be. Now we've got life. So this is 8 frames. This is our active. So this is how many frames in game that attack is active for, so 8 frames. Okay, now depending on your animation, depending on how many frames per second your game runs at, this means different stuff, right? So my game runs, this example runs at 60 frames per second, and the character animates at 0.15 frames of animation per frame in game. Now I know that's a little weird to understand, but if I animated my guy at 60 frames a second, this attack is 8 frames, like it would be over in less than 1/6 of a second. Not what we want. So he's animated independently of the game speed. So even though this exists for 8 real in-game frames per second, the animation is like 3 frames of animation. And then X hit, this is going to be 3 times facing, so it's going to knock back the guy I'm hitting 3 pixels per frame times the direction I'm facing. So that way I hit them to the right, hit them to the left, whatever. And then, of course, finally, hit stun, which is how many frames the guy that I'm hitting is going to be stunned for, in this case, 45 frames. So this creates our hitbox, sets a duration for how long that hitbox should exist for, and yeah, the rest of it is up to the hitbox, right? So we've created it, we've told it where to go, how big it needs to be, what kind of knockback it should have, how long it should stun the guy, all kinds of stuff. So let's look at that real quick before we move on to actually checking to see if it hits. Let's make this a little bigger. Okay, so there's my punch, right? The red box is the hitbox. You can see it extends into my character a little bit. It extends out a little bit. And the hitbox is a little bigger than the actual punch, right? And that's mostly just a feeling thing. If a hitbox is too small, it doesn't feel right. If it's too big, it doesn't feel right. But it's also a balance thing, right? If this hitbox took up the whole screen, well, obviously that's broken and stupid and no one should do that, right? But if it was too small, like, well, it makes the move so much more difficult to use, much more difficult to land attacks with. So that's another thing that you'll need to be aware of when designing hitboxes and hurtboxes. So let's get back to doing the actual collision. Oh, by the way, yeah, see, I can punch to the left, I can punch to the right, and it adjusts accordingly. Yeah. So now here's the good stuff. Here's the confusing stuff. Here's the thing that if anything in this overview is going to lose you, it's going to be this, because we're doing some weird Inception type stuff, okay? So you remember how we were doing with Hitbox, okay? We're basically, we're kind of running code from inside the Hitbox, but we need to do with again. So from inside the Hitbox, we need to address Hurtboxes. So we're going to use with O Hurtbox. Now, we're doing O Hurtbox here, okay? We're not doing the Hurtbox variable. There's 2 reasons for that. One, the Hitbox, which we're currently running code from inside of, does not have a Hurtbox variable. If we run it, the game's going to say, listen, you don't know what you're talking about. This variable doesn't exist. Get out of my face, and it's going to crash. And even if it did have a Hurtbox variable, that only stores the ID of a single Hurtbox, which not what we want. We need to check every Hurtbox that exists in the game at the time. Okay, so by doing with O Hurtbox, that basically runs this code, everything below it, right, inside of every existing Hurtbox. Okay, and here's why we do that. We do with Hurtbox, and then we check to see if place meeting, which basically means am I overlapping with other? Other being the hitbox that we're calling this code from. So it's comparing it back to an individual hitbox. So basically every Hurtbox is checking to see if they're touching this one particular hitbox. And the other owner, so the hitbox owner, does not equal the hurtbox owner. If they're the same owner, that means they belong to the same character, same team, however. They're different owners, they're different objects, and that means they should be able to hit each other. Now, we got to go back. We got to jump back a layer. So we're inside the hurt box right now. Okay, from here, we're inside the hurt box. Now we got to go back. We got to jump back to the hitbox. So with other again. Or we're using with again to do with other. And remember, other is the hitbox that is calling all this code in the first place. So quick overview, we've got the player object who's running code from their hitbox, which is checking or which is running code with all the hurt boxes, which is then running code from the hitbox. There's layers, okay? There's a diagram on the blog post that might help you understand it a little bit if you're lost, but basically we're just addressing objects from other objects and then back up. So here's where that ignore list comes into play. This is very important. If we did not have an ignore list, basically what would happen is remember our hitbox exists for 8 frames. If we didn't have some sort of check to make sure that we didn't already hit someone, then it could hit them 8 times, once per frame. And if it was doing damage, then it does 8 times the normal damage, not exactly what you want. So the easiest way to do that is we have a list that exists inside the hitbox. So remember, we've created this list called the ignore list. The ignore list stores every other object that has a hurtbox that this particular hitbox has collided with. Okay, so basically my hitbox comes out, touches another character's hurtbox, it adds that character's ID to my hitbox ignore list, which then says, which the hitbox checks every frame to see, is this thing that I'm colliding with on the ignore list? If no, hit it and then add it to the ignore list. If yes, if it is on the ignore list, then don't do anything because I've already hit you. So this is a for loop that does that. So the first thing we need to do is check to see if it's on the ignore list. So we're doing that by checking the size of the ignore list, okay? And we're checking each position on the ignore list based on its size to see if other.owner is on the list. If it is on the list, ignore it, don't do anything, break out of the for loop, and then just continue on with your life. Don't do anything. Now, if it's not on the ignore list, okay, ignore is always set to false, and then if it's on the ignore list, ignore is set to true, and then whatever. Now, if it's not on the ignore list and ignore continues to be false, then you actually hit them, okay? So other.owner means, remember we're running code from inside the hitbox right now, so other means the hurtbox, and owner is the owner of the hurtbox. So we say hit is true, and then we say that they were hit by this hitbox, and then we add them to the ignore list so that they can't be hit again. Now, what happens when they get hit, right? We need to figure that out. If you run this right now, if you've typed all this up, there's a couple variables that don't exist yet. So hit by, and actually I believe that's it. So I've got an enemy object here. The enemy object has the hit by variable, which is -1, because hit by is going to store an ID. Okay, so if setting it by a negative number, you ensure that it's never incorrect information because IDs are always positive. So by being a negative number, you don't run into any risk of something weird happening. And then I've got hit equals false. So I've also got a hit state. Now, like I said before, I'm not going to go back and explain the state machine stuff to you. That's in another blog. You can check that out. But basically, when you get hit, you get put into the hit state, which means you can't do anything, right? Because you're in a hit state. You can't do anything until your hit stun gets counted down from whatever it was. In our case, that's 45 frames, down to 0. Then reset your state to normal. Now, all this does is count down. It zeroes out your horizontal speed so that you don't just slide across the floor infinitely. And then, yeah, you just count back down to 0. Your hit stun counts back down to 0, then you return to normal, which is how hit stun works. You are stunned for X number of frames, in this case 45, and to make sure that you have no control over your character during that time, I have a specific state that the player is put in when they are hit, where they have no access to their controller, they have no access to their buttons, attacks, movement, nothing. Like, you're at the mercy of the guy punching you in the face. Now, we need to actually set the enemy to the hit state. And we do that just by checking to say, hey, is hit true? Because remember, we set hit to true here. So if hit is true, first we need to apply our X hit, which is our horizontal knockback from the guy who's hitting us. The hit stun, which is the stun duration of the guy who's hitting us. And then I have it, you don't have to do this, but make the character who's been hit face the person who hit them. And then you just set hit back to false, and you switch them into the hit state, where they have no control over their character. Squash and stretch, this just makes their sprite kind of like bump up a little bit. It gets a little bigger and then goes back down to normal size. That's also a blog explaining how to do that, which will be provided below. There's an animation state that goes along with the being hit. So it just sets your sprite, sets the enemy sprite to the correct sprite when they're hit. And then it's animated the same as the player. All that is also explained in another blog. Now if I run the game, it should be able to run around and punch. And now my hitbox should, boom, hit the guy, right? And then based on the direction I'm facing, knocks him backwards, changes his sprite, puts him into stun. Cool. It's basically everything that needs to be done, right? So that's basically it. It's the basic concept of hitboxes and hurtboxes in a really simple way, how to set them up in GameMaker. Now, if you have any other questions or comments about this, feel free to contact me. You can follow me on Twitter at RatCasket. But yeah, that pretty much covers it. So thank you for taking the time to follow along with me, and I really hope you learned something. Thanks.